Hi, Mayor. This is Dina, your Zoom host. I'm assisting with the Long-Term Financial Policy and Audit Subcommittee meeting. I'm working with the recording secretary, Elisa, to facilitate the meeting. It looks like we're just waiting for Council Member or Vice Mayor Fleming to log in.
And she did say she was going to be a few minutes late, right?
Yeah, and she may also be an attendee.
I haven't seen her yet pop into the attendee list.
That's how I got on, was I hit, although I'd never seen the screen before, it said, it looked, they keep changing how, well, not always, but this was different than the other screens I've seen before in joining the meeting.
Yeah, and so we're live to the public now, and Zoom does frequent updates. And what I'm finding is there's little nuanced changes that we roll with.
Yeah.
So it's not you, John.
Okay.
Dina, on the phone, 47, I think, is Vice Mayor Fleming. If you could promote 47.
Let's see here. Because she's dialing in from a telephone number, I cannot promote her to a panelist. So she'll only have speaking permissions enabled.
All righty. So if we could go the resident with the last four like we do too, just so when we...
I can rename her entirely to Victoria Fleming if you're confident that's her phone number.
That would be helpful for me.
Okay, will do. One moment. Hi, Vice Mayor Fleming, can you confirm this is you?
Indeed.
Thank you.
All right, Dina, so we're ready to roll?
We're ready to roll, and recording secretary Elisa is going to be ready for roll call when you call it.
Okay, Elisa, could we call for a roll call?
Yes. Chair Schwethelm.
Here.
Member Fleming.
Present.
Member Sawyer.
Here.
All right, let the order reflect that all subcommittee members are present.
Okay, some housekeeping for those of us on the committee. Please keep your audio on mute unless you're speaking. Staff will remain muted until needing to speak. As members of the public join the meeting, you'll be participating as an attendee. Your microphone and camera will be muted. Only today's panelists will be viewed during the meeting. If you're calling in from a telephone and choose to speak during the public comments portion of today's agenda, for privacy concerns, the host will be renaming your viewable phone number to resident in the last 4 digits of your phone number. Madam Recording Secretary, could you please explain how public comments will be heard at today's meeting?
Yes, so at each agenda item, the item is presented. The chair will ask for subcommittee member comments and then open it up for public comment. The host in the Zoom meeting will be lowering all hands until public comment is open for the agenda item. Once the chair has called for public comment, the chair will announce for the public to raise their hand if they wish to speak on the specific agenda item. If you are calling in to listen in the meeting audibly, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. The host will then call on the public who have raised their hands. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes, and a timer will appear on the screen for the subcommittee members and public to see. Once all live public comments have been heard, the meeting host will read emails submitted. If you provided a live public comment on an agenda item, but also submitted an email, your email comment will not be read during the meeting. Additionally, there is one public comment period on today's agenda to speak on non-agenda matters, which is item 2. This is the time when any person may address the subcommittee on matters not listed on this agenda.
Okay, with that, we will now move to item 2 on our agenda, which is public comment. So we are now taking public comment on item 2, non-agenda matters. This is the time when any person may address the subcommittee on matters not listed on this agenda. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Madam Host, would you take it from here?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. A countdown timer is on your screen for the convenience of the speakers and the viewers. If you're dialing in audibly, there will be an audio indicator at the end of your public comment period. Please make sure when you are called upon to unmute yourself. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown. Mayor, at this time, I'm not seeing any hands raised for public comment, and there were no non-agenda item matters public comment emails received.
Great, thank you. And no voicemails for item 2 also?
Correct. For this subcommittee, for the long-term financial policy subcommittee, they were only accepting email public comments prior to the meeting and
Great.
live public comments.
Okay, thank you. On to item 3, approval of minutes. Mr. Sawyer and Ms. Fleming, did you get a chance to read the minutes, and do you have any adjustments or alterations?
They're
No
fine with me as is.
Okay, I would entertain a motion. Well, we'll just accept those motions or those minutes as submitted. All right, item 4, 4.1. Mr. Alton, are you introducing this item?
I am, Mayor.
All right, you're on.
All right. Mayor Schwadehelm and members of the committee, as you know, we have 3 add-on transaction and use measures. Each of them are $0.25 cents. One of them is a public safety special tax, and the other 2 are general taxes. All 3 of those will expire. 2 of them expire in 2025 and 1 expires in 2027. So with that, and given the state of our structural deficit, the issues we are dealing with from a budget standpoint with the COVID pandemic, we thought it would be good to engage our polling consultants to take a survey of voters in Santa Rosa to kind of gauge the feasibility of extending those measures. So we engage the services of Godby Research and TVWBH to come up with a question and then to do the survey results. And Brian Godby of Godby Research is here to provide a presentation of the survey results. So with that,
Brian, your speaking permissions are enabled and you can unmute yourself to make your presentation.
Hello, this is Brian Godby.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. You are ready to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Seemed to drop out on my end. Sorry about that. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. Am I going to be able to advance the slides, or do I need to ask you to?
Please let me know when you want to the next slide, advance to the next slide.
All right,
and
yeah,
I'll be
let's go ahead and go to the next slide. As Alan mentioned, the purpose of the survey was multifold. First of all, we have a warm-up section, a climate section, if you will, that we wanted to see what the background is that a measure might be on the ballot. And that was a couple different questions. First of all, it was checking in to see what people thought about the state and local government's efforts to address the coronavirus. We wanted to look at their forecast for the future direction of the economy. We wanted to look and see what they thought about the city's services. Of course, there are a couple ballot measures, and we'll talk about that as we get there. We looked at a variety of different things we might spend the money on from the various measures. We wanted to test influence of both positive and negative statements on voter support. And then we wanted to look at different rate and duration alternatives by the end of the survey. And of course, there's a wide variety of demographic and behavioral information that we use to validate that the sample is representative of the likely voter universe. Next slide, please. Drilling down a little bit more into the specific methodology, as we've done in the past in Santa Rosa. This is an online and a phone survey. The number of online surveys is going up dramatically for all of our clients as we become more and more attuned to text messaging particularly. And there were text invitations to an online survey, as well as email invitations to an online survey. And then of course, there are additional landlines where we use to fill out with those people who are still not quite comfortable with the online to make sure that we have the demographic representation that we want. In terms of the universe, it was likely November 2020 voters in the city of Santa Rosa. We were in the field from June 17th through 25th. The average phone survey was 20 minutes long. We don't know how long it takes people to take the survey online, but we know that they hit the final submit button around the clock, which is great because now we're on their time schedule as opposed to the opposite, where we're limited to when we could call them. We completed 1,524 interviews, which is better than we did back in 2018. And one of the things we've been seeing, not only is the online component of surveys become very popular, but also since the coronavirus shelter in place, our response rates are actually up. And they remain up because people are at home in many cases. All of that gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 2.49, 2.5% in round numbers. Any questions about the methodology? Okay, hearing none, let's move to the next slide. And the next slide after this. So as I mentioned, the first section of the survey is the climate section. And this first question is, did people have a favorable or unfavorable view of the job that the state, local governments, including Sonoma County and the city of Santa Rosa and local school districts are doing to address the coronavirus crisis in Santa Rosa? We ask and somewhat on both sides of the equation. For analytical purposes, obviously this is a new question since the shelter in place, but the way we've been looking at it is adding the vary and somewhats together on both sides of the equation. You see that 68% favorable, 26% unfavorable. That's a 2.7 to 1 ratio of positive to negative. Obviously at 68%, it's a little over a 2/3 majority that have a favorable view of the job that's being done, which is a pretty overwhelming number. Now, comparing this to other communities, because we don't really have a early measure and then a late measure for Santa Rosa, we just have what we have. But when we first started this down in San Mateo County, we had a city that hit a high of 80% favorable. And we've had a low of a county up in the far northern part of the state that was at 57% favorable. So you see there's been a wide range. Some of that may be due to the demographics of those particular areas. It also seems to be that the numbers are pretty consistently declining from that high water mark. And that's probably true because it's been a long time and there's cabin fever setting in. People would like to be outside and not necessarily able to do that. Next slide, please. The next question in this section was perception of the future of the economy, and 33% think it's going to be better, 30% think it'll be about the same, and 29% think it'll be worse in the fall of this year when these measures might be on the ballot. Again, in terms of the range of the worst, we've seen it as high as 44%. So people in Santa Rosa aren't that pessimistic. We've also seen it as low as 20%. And so while that's still a chunk of people that think it's going to be worse, that's the low watermark that we've seen. And so you're kind of a little on the low end of the middle, which is, I think, encouraging. Next slide, please. So the next question was, is Santa Rosa on the right track or going the wrong direction? 38% said it was on the right track. 36% said it's going the wrong direction, and 26% didn't know or had no answer. We have this tracked from the 2018 surveys, and you can see down in the box in the lower left-hand corner that, again, we're at 38% right track. We were at 34% in November 18. So we're actually doing a little better than we were 2 years ago when we asked this same question. Next slide, please. The final question in this section was the satisfaction with the city's services. The way we ask this is, are you satisfied or dissatisfied, and broken down into vary and somewhat. For analytical purposes, it's easier to keep them aggregated. So you see that the total satisfaction is 62%. Dissatisfaction is 32%. That's a ratio of 1.9 to 1, satisfied to dissatisfied. When we compare that to the November 18 survey, we were at 61 and 34, and a 1.8 to 1. So we're actually a little bit better. Statistically, probably not significant, but it's always good to see it improving. Next slide, please. So at this point in the survey, we switched gears and focused more specifically on the ballot measures, and we employed a split sample methodology. So we really asked about two distinct measures. They're both sales taxes, but this first one was a general sales tax. So as you can see from the bullets here, we're talking about public safety, maintain Santa Rosa fire, police, paramedic, combating gang violence, maintaining crime prevention, improving disaster and wildfire and pandemic preparedness. This question meets the state requirements. Those are that it must not be more than 75 words. It has to have the tax rate, obviously. In this case, we're saying extending the existing voter-approved sales tax at a revised rate of 1/2 cent. We have to say how much it raises annually. That's $18 million in this case. And then what the term is, and this is proposing an until ended by voters or in perpetuity term. All of this has been vetted by your city attorney and meets with the state law. The way we analyze this question is we add the definitely and probably together, and you can see we're at 52.4%, which, since this is a special tax, that's quite a ways off. For a special tax to be successful, as you know, this needs 66.7%. So we've got 15 points to go to be at that level. Next slide, please. So the other part of our, no, go back one. There are two that look the same. There you go. So this is the other half of the split sample. So again, within that 1,500 and change universe that we sampled, half randomly got the first question, half randomly got this question. And this is designed to be a general sales tax. And what this does, as you can see from looking at the details toward the bottom, is it extends and consolidates the existing voter-approved sales taxes without changing the rate for all three of those taxes, as Alan mentioned. Still at 0.75 cents, it would provide $27 million annually, but the term wouldn't be switched to until ended by voters. So this, because it's a general tax, only requires a simple majority. And as you can see by adding the definitely and probably together, we're at 61% in round numbers. Where the special tax was 15 points below the threshold, here we're almost 11 points above the threshold. So a dramatic difference. Obviously, the other difference here as well is that there's a broader list of things that we're suggesting that we might be able to do. Okay, let's move on to the next question now. So here we have the first of a couple slides that are the things that we might spend the money on for either of these measures. And there's a split sample approach related to whether it's a general or the special tax. And you'll see that in the colored bars here. But we lumped them all together so you could get a sense of what the voters' priorities are. And the way this question was asked is we presented each of these items that you see on the left-hand side in a random order. And then we said, does this make you much more likely, somewhat less likely, or much less likely to support the measure based on knowing that it would pay for this particular item? When we're done with the interviewing, we go back and assign numeric values to each of those responses. So a much more likely is a 2, a somewhat more likely is a 1, a somewhat less likely is a -1, and a much less likely is a -2, because there are lots of responses there and it gets confusing adding the percentages. We create this intensity scale, which you see here, ranging from 1.16 down to 1.03. And that's just a really accurate way of ranking these items. We also create what are called tiers, and everything on this item is in tier 1. And basically, those are things that are statistically tied. And to put that into context vis-a-vis the simple majority or the 2/3 majority that we need to be successful, we've got the range of percentages that are much more likely plus somewhat more likely. So you see that maintained fire protection services at 1.16 in our intensity scale is 76% at least somewhat more likely to support the measure. And that ranges all the way down to 71. If you think back to that 2.5–3% error rate, you can quickly see how these are all basically tied. I mean, there are numeric differences, and that's important. But essentially they're all grouped together. So in addition to the maintained fire protection services, which I mentioned, we see that we also have prevent future fires. So obviously a fire-related component. Then we have keep parks and playgrounds clean, safe, and well-maintained. Improve disaster and wildfire and pandemic preparedness and response. So not a specific COVID-19, but pretty direct in referencing the pandemic. Then we have repairing potholes in city streets, providing mental health programs, rebuilding firefighting infrastructure, maintaining emergency disaster and preparedness programs, including public health, public health crisis. Again, obviously a little bit of a generic reference to where we are today. And then preventing reductions in the number of on-duty firefighters and paramedics. So you see there's certainly a fire and emergency response component that are testing well if we're thinking just about a special tax. If we're thinking about a general tax, then all of these things, we have the fire, the disaster preparedness, the potholes, the parks, etc. If we could go on to the next slide. So the next slide shows the rest of this question, and it was a long list. Basically, these are the lower items. It's the continuation of tier 1, but we're starting to dip below the 60 or the 70% level. Still, for a general tax, that's great, but for a special tax, by the time we're at the bottom of this list, we're below the 2/3 threshold. And you see some of the things are senior services. Again, that would be a general tax item. Prepare for fire season and potential public safety, power shutoffs. That could be general tax as well. Maintain 911 response. That's either special or general. And then we move into tier 2, which for the special tax is below the threshold we need to be at. But again, still pretty solid for a general tax. Next slide, please. And this was a long question set, and this is the remainder of those items that we asked. I won't read all of them in deference to your time. Obviously, they are not as important as that first set of items. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, this looks like it's a similar kind of question, and it is. There is a caveat, and that is that the scale is different. It is just 2, 1, 0. So there's no minus side of the equation. So that just means that the scale is a little different, and you can't compare them apples to apples with the previous slide, but you can still rank things the same way. And we still have the tiers, and we still show the percentage ranges to give you an idea of where we fall vis-a-vis the 2/3 or general tax thresholds. So at the top of this list, we have none of the money raised by this measure would be used for city administrator salaries. And obviously that's a really strong item at 1.42 or about 76% in round numbers. Then we have the measure will give Santa Rosa local control over local funds for local needs, and the money can't be taken by the state, is what's after that ellipses there. It doesn't all fit obviously on the PowerPoint slide, but it can't be taken by Sacramento. So that's at 1.31, a little bit lower, but again, statistically pretty much tied. Then we have the measure will keep the city's fire stations open. The measure will require independent citizens oversight and mandatory financial audits, another accountability component. And then finally, in the top tier, the measure simply extends what we are already paying for essential local city services. It does not increase tax rates above the current rate structure. Obviously, that's specific to the general tax approach that we talked about earlier. All of those are in the low to mid 70s, so that's a good place to be for either of the tax types, but particularly for a general tax. In the second tier, we have a variety of items, again, still pretty important because they're in the 70s. Park and recreation, visitors and shoppers from outside Santa Rosa will help pay their fair share, so the burden's not exclusively on homeowners. This funding will help upgrade aging emergency communication systems to help firefighters, paramedics, and police officers respond quickly in an earthquake, fire, or other emergency. The measure is critical for helping Santa Rosa recover from the devastating fires in recent years. And if we go to the next slide, you see we continue down the list. Again, in deference to your time, I won't read all of these. They're all still pretty positive if we're talking about a general tax. If we're talking about a special tax, they're right on the bubble or below. So they're not really getting us to the threshold we need to be at for a special tax. So at this point in the survey, well, actually, let's go to the next slide. This is the rest of the questions in this question set. And again, we're going lower. And by the time we get to the bottom of this list, we're even below the general tax simple majority threshold. So at this point in the survey, we've talked about the ballot questions in both cases. We've talked about what we'd spend the money on. We've talked about some of these informational statements, which are positive arguments and accountability. And then we come back to our ballot questions. Next slide, please. a second time. And so this is the special tax. Again, you see the wording on the right-hand side. It's the same as the earlier version that we looked at. And we've gone from 52.4 to 59.8, which is what you'd expect after hearing all the positives about it. But we don't get to the 2/3 threshold. We're still 7 points below where we would need to be successful for a special tax measure on public safety. Next slide. So this is the general tax, the second test, and we go from 60.5 up to 68.7. And so well over the simple majority required for a general tax, and even reaching the 2/3. Now, I'm not suggesting that this should become a special tax because the way it's structured, having it pay for a variety of things does make it a general tax. And this doesn't suggest changing that, but it does suggest that there's a wide variety of support for this varying list of different kinds of city services. Okay, next slide, please. Because the world isn't perfect or the way we'd like it to be, we then go to a question of negatives or critical statements. The methodology here is pretty much the same as the informational statements. We don't put a minus sign in front of any of the numbers to make them seem bad. The higher they are, the worse they are for these particular measures. And again, in tier 1, we have a variety of items. At the top, we have city government needs to cut waste and do a better job with taxpayer money that they already take. So a pretty standard anti-tax argument at 1.0, or 57% at least somewhat more likely to oppose the measure. Now, it's important to note that that's above the simple majority threshold necessary to defeat a general tax. It's certainly way above the 33.4% threshold necessary to defeat a special tax. The next item is public employee salaries, benefits, and pensions are out of control. We need to contain these costs before we look at increasing taxes. Then if the measure to gut Prop 13 will be on the ballot at the same time with this measure, and this measure is just another increase in local property taxes, we can't afford all these new taxes. That's obviously reference to the split roll measure, which is on the ballot statewide. And obviously we'll have huge campaigns on both sides, pro and con. And this is fundamentally the anti-split roll argument. And the final item in tier 1 is the county is putting a transportation sales tax on the ballot at the same time, and other public agencies may do so as well. We can't afford all these new taxes. So that one is notable because it obviously is true, and it's has an impact, certainly has an impact on a special tax, but it's right below the simple majority threshold needed to defeat a general tax. So while, I don't want to say that we should ignore it, it's, not as impactful as some of these other items at the top of the list. In the next tier, we've got if PG&E paid for the damage they caused, we wouldn't need the tax. We just voted to increase our sales tax 2 years ago. Now they want to extend it forever. And the third one in tier 2 is notable because that's the coronavirus anti-tax measure argument. Given the coronavirus crisis and the financial fallout, we can't afford a new tax now. And what's interesting here is pretty much everybody, the prevailing wisdom when the shelter in place went into order, went into place, was that no one would ever pass a tax because of the coronavirus and the fallout. But what's interesting here is it's not the number one argument. It's all those traditional anti-tax arguments that are much more persuasive. Now that we shouldn't ignore it, it's still 44%, at least somewhat more likely to oppose either of the measures. That's really consequential for a special tax, less so for a general tax. But again, it's not what the prevailing wisdom said back in March, that we just can't do this now. It's the typical anti-tax arguments that are more impactful. Next slide, please. So now that we have talked about what we'd spend the money on, we've talked about the positives and seen how high we can move the numbers up, and we just went through all the negatives, and we come back to our ballot question immediately after that to see how much that pushes us back down. And here for the special tax, you see that we're at 52%. When we started, we went up to 51.5, rounds up to 52. So we're basically at the same point as where we started. Obviously, for a special tax, this is not a good place to be. Next slide. So the follow-up question, because we didn't know where we were going to wind up, we said, well, what if instead of raising it by 1/2 cent or by 1/4 cent to 1/2 cent, what if we kept it at the existing 1/4 cent for the public safety sales tax? And that doesn't really help us. When we're doing that, basically, we're just focusing them on the tax rates, and we're only at 47% support. So obviously it goes down. And that's just, there's no improvement. Obviously it would have had to been dramatic to get us to the 2/3 threshold, but we're not even getting even a little bit of a bump. And the next fallback question was, well, what if we changed from, if I could go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, what if we changed from until ended by voters or the in perpetuity to just 9 years? And again, you see that that doesn't do anything to help us. So pretty much the special tax is a non-starter. Sorry, now go back or go on to the next slide. So coming back again to our final test on the general tax, again, this is right following those negatives. You see that we started at 61 in round numbers, and we're now at 60 in round numbers, even though we just really beat ourselves up pretty hard with those anti-tax and even the COVID anti-tax argument. But we're still at 60%. And with a 3% error rate, if we're rounding, that means this could be as low as 57%, which still gives us a 7-point cushion over the general tax simple majority threshold that we need to be successful with this measure. Next slide, please. Thank you. And again, we didn't know where we were going to wind up, so we thought, let's try a fallback. Instead of 3/4 of a cent, what if it was a 1/2 cent, just a 1/2 cent? And this would be extending only 2 of the 3 taxes, obviously. And here we're at 57%. Again, it doesn't improve our numbers. It's just about at the same level as we were before. So there's no real reason, given that we're exceeding the simple majority threshold, to have to go down to a 1/2 cent. We can probably move forward at the 3/4 cent, renewing these measures together. And then finally, next slide. We did the same thing with duration, and we now go from the until ended by voters, where we're at 60, and for 9 years we're just at 53%. While that seems counterintuitive in both cases, it's really a pattern that we see over and over again. And it's, I think, because the idea of the in perpetuity being phrased as until ended by voters, which has been vetted by your city attorney and has been on the ballot in many, many other places, so it's legal, that empowers voters more than the 9 years. The 9 years to them sounds like it's set in stone and there's nothing they can do about it. So this doesn't really help, and that suggests that a 3/4 cent sales tax consolidation and extension does have a good deal of viability, and something that council may want to consider. Obviously, it's your decision on whether you move that forward or not, but the survey suggests that it is certainly feasible. So that's the end of the survey component. I know my colleague Charles has, well, I've got a summary which basically says what I just said, that a consolidated extension at 3/4 does well. It can be until ended by voters, and then everything else is the features that we talked about already. And the next slide, please, is the informational statements that that we already talked about again. I don't want to read them over again. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the survey data, or I can turn it over to my colleague Charles Heath to talk about some timing issues.
All right, thank you, Brian. Let me check with my colleagues. Mr. Sawyer, do you have any questions?
I really don't, and it's a lot of information to absorb. I was wondering if we would be having a chance to get this in hard copy.
We can do that. I mean, it's now public, so this is a public Brown Act meeting, so that's certainly doable. And the city does already have the whole presentation.
I do have one question. Early in the slides, I think it might have been the third or fourth one, there was a question about, or there was a rating on a question regarding homelessness. And I wanted to confirm what the, what question was being answered by that question on homelessness. I think it might have been the fourth slide.
Yeah, it was provide services to reduce homelessness. So that was in the context of the features of the measure, the things we might spend the money on. It obviously would be a general tax item. It had a score of 0.76 on our intensity scale, and the percentage that had was, one second, let me flip to the right page, was 64%, at least somewhat more likely to support it. It's certainly well above the simple majority threshold, so it is something that's important to voters. It's just not as important to those items that were earlier on the earlier slide.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Madam Vice Mayor, do you have any questions? Oh, you're muted. I'm not hearing anything. Dina, can you help?
Oh, now I'm unmuted. Okay, thank you. Sorry, there was a problem with the microphone with the new version of Zoom. So I just wanted to thank you guys for all the good data, but I wanted to also double down on what Councilmember Sawyer said, which is that this is a lot of information and would like a chance to review it in hard copy now that it's a public document. That'd be really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, and Brian, the question I had, because I know you talked about the road tax, it's also, we have an understanding that the county may be going forward with the mental health tax. How would we factor that into this discussion? If both of those are going to be on there, how would this compete against two county measures that address some of the questions that were asked during this polling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because the transportation sales tax was in the top tier, that's of concern, but the transportation tax only got 47%, at least somewhat more likely to oppose the measure. So obviously, if we double down on that tax rate, I think you could assume it would be negative, but we've got plenty of positives on our side that we saw kept the number up at 60% even after all the negatives. So I think it would have an impact, but I think we're still going to be above the simple majority threshold. Obviously, for a general tax, for a special tax, that's, it's a non-starter anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Right, and so knowing the way Measure O is currently arranged with an oversight committee, I'm not sure, again, there's a lot of data there. If we go the 3/4 cents sales tax, do we lose any oversight, and it's totally up to city council to determine where to allocate those sales tax dollars?
So the general tax is up to the council. That's always the case. Obviously, the way we have written it, and again, vetted by the city attorney, we talk about a variety of different things we might use the money for. Even though it's not a legal requirement to spend it on those items, there is an implicit political promise. So there is some constraints on there. And there's also those accountability components that we talked about. The money wouldn't be used for administrator salaries, can't be taken by Sacramento, and an independent citizens oversight. So we would roll that all into this new measure. So you would still have an oversight committee. It's a little more amorphous because it's a general tax, but that's true for general taxes in cities throughout the state, and virtually all of them have that same independent citizens oversight to make sure that the money is being spent wisely, even though it's a general tax.
And this might be a question for our city attorney. Just in light of some of the conversations we're having with community members, it would be interesting to entertain if a portion of this went to, I think they call it participative budgeting, or actually a group of the community members prioritize, this is what we want this money spent on. How would that factor into any of this? And when, if we wanted to put such a clause in what the use of these dollars would that be coming back to council if we agree to go in this direction and the actual language of that?
This is Sue Gallagher, city attorney. As a general tax, it can be spent on anything, any services, and whether that could be carved out, I think you could make that proposal, but I would be concerned about trying to embed that in the ordinance itself, but I can sure look at that further as to whether that would be a possibility.
I'm just, and Brian mentioned it in light of some of the recent unsuccessful measures, that there was somewhat of a clear message that some voters don't trust that the dollars will be used in the manner in which they were voting for them to be used on, and they didn't pass it. And it's just a thought that if we say, well, and I think it's called participative budgeting, is a concept that some communities do. I know it started in Chicago with a certain percentage of it. And you say 10% of this or 5%, whatever percent, will actually let a group of community members make the decision on how to allocate those funds. That's kind of where I'm going with it, because that is something I've been hearing from our community in many of the community listening sessions I've been participating in the last couple of weeks.
The other, if I may, the other options that I have seen is a measure coupled with an advisory measure indicating where the kind of the political commitment is. It's not binding ultimately from a legal perspective, but it does it does give the voters at least a political commitment that this is how the measure would be played out.
Okay, thank you.
I'd have to research that as well, just to confirm that that's still a possibility. That was a couple of years ago that I've seen that done.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sawyer, do you have a question?
I do, thank you, Mayor. I have to believe that part of the high level of popularity of the Public Safety Measure O sales tax was the restriction on backfilling and the oversight in how it was going to be spent. It was, fairly restrictive, and I would be concerned how not having those two elements would affect the final numbers on our original Measure O.
I would agree. Okay, Victoria, do you have any other questions? Okay, Brian, you said Charles will be making some comments?
Yeah, he has another slide, I believe.
Yeah, if we can bring the presentation back up, I'd appreciate it. And just go forward to the, should be one slide before this one, I believe. Or maybe it's after that one you just showed. There we go. Perfect, thank you. So I'm Charles Heath. I'm the city's strategy and communications consultant for the revenue measure. What we have here is the timeline summarizing the revenue measure process and the next steps if we were to move forward with placing a measure on the ballot. So we're here today delivering the results of the feasibility study. We'll be doing the same thing with the full council later this month. Assuming there's a decision to move forward with a measure for the November ballot, the next step in the process would be to begin doing some informational outreach and consensus building. While the city is prohibited from advocating for the passage of a sales tax measure, you do have the ability to provide impartial information about your budget situation and what this the revenue from this measure might do if it were approved. So like we did in 2018 with the last sales tax proposal, we would help you put together impartial information and a plan for getting that out to the community, using both digital and print communication channels to tell that story. Parallel to that, the next step would be to actually build the measure for the ballot. That's where we would work closely with the city attorney to develop the specific language of the proposal, fine tune it based on the results of Godby's research, and then bring that back to the council for final approval. Once the council votes to call for the election, that's the point typically at which the city steps back as the primary voice communicating about the measure and the related issues, and an advocacy campaign steps forward. By law, no public resources can be used to support that advocacy effort, and public resources is defined broadly in terms of public staff time, facilities, but also city monies. So any advocacy would have to be privately funded through fundraising and coordinated independent of the city. So just wanted to offer that as kind of a timeline and next steps for moving forward if the council decides to move forward with a November measure. And happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you for that. John or Victoria, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a relatively new council member. I've only been with on the council for 18 or 19, a year and a half or so. And so when I have a question about the advocacy piece, since this will be my first ballot measure if we were to go forward with one, which is, you say no public resources. So how is it typically done that the resources are raised in order to fund an advocacy campaign for a proposition or a measure?
Sure. So the key is it has to happen separate and apart from the city's effort to place the measure on the ballot and to provide any informational communication. But typically what that looks like is council members can certainly be involved in that effort. Given that you're not full-time employees of the city, like the city manager or others, you have some flexibility to be involved in that advocacy process because you're not on the public dime, so to speak, during the normal workday. Also, your employee associations can certainly be involved in that process, as well as other interested community members that are, looking to see this measure be approved to help preserve city services. So oftentimes, we'll work with council members and other community stakeholders to try to identify a small committee that would spearhead that advocacy campaign effort. They form an independent campaign committee, file paperwork with the FPPC, similar to what you do when you run for your council seats, raise private money from similar interested parties, and then use those resources to mount an advocacy campaign. So for a November ballot measure, you'd be looking to ensure that, that advocacy piece was coming together in the August timeframe, so that the campaign is prepared to communicate with voters in advance of absentee ballots going out the first week in October, and so on to the campaign, so to election day.
Okay, thank you.
And Charles, I don't know if this would be a question for you or for Brian. I noticed there was one question regarding PG&E paying for all the damage. Now, obviously, the city of Santa Rosa will be receiving tens of millions of dollars, but that does not cover all of the damage created by the fires. Brian, how would we interpret that feedback, or Charles?
Yeah, so that was a negative question, and we posed it as something that would make people less likely to support a consolidation tax measure or a renewal of the public safety tax measure. So the wording was, if PG&E paid for the damage they caused, we would not need this measure. So it doesn't get into the details of is PG&E paying enough or not enough. It's just sort of trying to conflate the PG&E is paying something with we don't need a new tax. And it's impactful. It's at the top of the second tier, and it is about 42%, at least somewhat more likely to oppose the measure. But again, it's sort of not trying to be completely candid. It's trying to turn it into a talking point against the measures. The way
So
it.
You just read the question, so it wasn't like, if the city receives tens of millions of dollars, would you still support this revenue?
No, it was sort of pushing the negative narrative rather than letting people say yes or no it's really leaning them into a negative approach.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from either of you? Seeing none. We're now going to take public comment on item 4.1, revenue measure polling data. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Move it to our Zoom host.
Thank you, Mayor. One moment while I share my screen. Okay, now's the time on the agenda where you can speak to item 4.1, revenue measure ballot or polling data. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in by telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Mayor, I'm seeing no members of the public raise their hand for public comment, and we received no email public comments for this item.
Okay, thank you. Then if I can go back to Mr. Alton, did you have any specific questions from our subcommittee? Because I, for one, don't feel comfortable making a recommendation or any thoughts because of the volume of the information. But do you have a specific feedback you would like from the three of us?
Yes. Well, a couple of things. I think what I want to do is we are on a rather tight time frame with this, unfortunately. So I think, well, I know we're going on the 21st. That's when it'll be to council. Oh, by the way, Elisa just sent you all the presentation, so look for it in your email. And then we may have one additional, it depends on how the meeting on August 1st works out. I know that's goal setting then, but I'm not sure if we're having a small part of a meeting at the end of goal setting or how that's working. I know Sean might be able to speak to that, but I guess my point is that I can, if you don't want to give a recommendation on where you would like to go, I guess I could put in the staff report that the committee recommended that the presentation go to council for a broader discussion. I could put it in that way, and then we could have that broad discussion. That said, we just don't have a lot of opportunities, unfortunately, to make a decision before our deadline to go to be to the registrar of voters. That's and yeah, it's just unfortunate that the time frame is just cramped. Those were you know, it's kind of less question and more of just I want to make sure that you're aware of that as you go as we go through this.
So Alan, I'm going to step in a little bit here. I think understand that we wanted to make sure that the subcommittee got a chance to look at this. If there's any individual follow-up questions that we can help the subcommittee with, happy to answer those. Alan and I will be available. We will bring the presentation back for the full council. There may be some action items embedded in that for council to make a decision because it is a tight and narrow time frame. We'll look at the 4th, but the 4th is going to be dedicated to goal setting. But specifically, if there was anything else, I hear the desire to have Sue look at what is the boundary between a specific tax and a special tax and a general tax, and how much council can influence the general tax question. I think what we just wanted to show the subcommittee is that there seems to be a possibility to handle a general tax in the fall, but a special tax, there is not going to be any ability to handle a special tax. We're getting this data as you're getting the data. We received it late last week. So it is going to be a quick turnaround. Any input you can provide Alan and I before the 21st would be greatly appreciated. But there will probably be a series of questions that we're asking the full council to make a determination, because the window is very narrow if there is going to be any attempt to move this to the election. So we have what we need. I think Alan was hoping that we would, you might have more input on this, but we understand where we are, and we'll bring it forward on the 21st.
Yeah, and there may be, because I will solicit, because I do have a little bit more feedback. One question that I didn't hear or one answer I didn't hear, if we do choose to put it on the ballot, what will it cost us?
So I don't know if Dina has that number. We can get that out to the council. We had budgeted for one ballot question in the budget. I do know that. I don't know if we have this specific. Alan, do we have a specific number of the costing?
I don't have that.
I'll make sure we get it provided to the subcommittee through Sean and or Alan.
But we had budgeted for that in the budget process, the general election for the 4 council seats and a potential ballot measure.
Okay, great. Well, let's give any feedback we want. Mr. Sawyer, you're first.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to confirm we have deadlines on when these tax measures are going to sunset, and I had forgotten actually. It was good to hear Mr. McGlynn mention that going for a special tax appears to be off the table at this point, given the numbers that we were seeing. On a general tax, what was the rate that was recommended for the general tax?
Well, there are two testing places that you'd have, and they're coming in at a very similar level. One was remember there were 3 quarter-cent sales tax measures that the council has adopted over time, general tax. Mm-hmm. So the question was, can you make those 3 work, or were you better off with only going forward asking for a half? And based on the questions that were the response rates, they come in at about the same. There isn't a significant differentiation between asking for 3/4 cent or ½ cent. The challenge for the city is all those quarter-cent sales tax measures expire at about the same time. It's a $27 million hit to the general fund. At the same time, you'll be wrestling with the Measure O and the quarter-cent sales tax measure around Measure O. And so the timing is, everything is happening concurrently. And that makes it very difficult to defer. If you don't start to take action right now, you'll be faced with wrestling with 4 sales tax measures at the same time.
Right, exactly. So would it be possible to add one slide that would be a culmination of either kind of a simple, I'm not sure how simple it would be, but a slide that speaks to that very issue about how much we would be losing, when we would be losing it, what the fact that a special tax looks like it's off the table, that there are 2 possibilities with a general tax, just kind of a synopsis. Absolutely. Not only of recommendation, but of our reality would I think helpful either in the beginning or the end of the presentation, so that the council would get a kind of a brief recap of the situation we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Ms. Vice Mayor, do you have any comments you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, the timeline is unfortunate, but it is what it is. I'm glad to hear that there is, some appetite for while I'm generally loath to implement sales taxes, I'm glad to hear that there's some appetite for one that would be in effect until voters rescinded it, so that we are not in this position, at least until we address our structural deficit or something like that. So I'm in support of bringing it to the full council, and you know, with the additional comments from other council members, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Schwedhelm. Hi, Mayor Schwedhelm. This is Dina. Stephanie Williams, our city clerk, was able to provide me the price. The high end for one ballot measure is $349,283 for one measure to be put on the ballot. That's the high end. It's a range, but we always err on the side of the high.
Thank you. And I know I recognize that we did set aside money for this budget. Not sure if that would cover all of it, but so I'm in agreement. Let's bring it to the entire city council. Where my level of uncomfortableness is, if that's such a word, is the voter appetite once we do receive the PG&E settlement. We all know the impact to our infrastructure, and that money is so many different ways it can be spent. And it's kind of that unknown, because council will be making the decision on how to spend that. If it's not believed of the voters that is the great use of those dollars, I think that could have an impact on them supporting this. Additionally, the mental health, how the county is going to be going about trying to pass that one, I think that could have a significant impact on this. But again, as others have said, we are where we are, and we'll just move forward. So I think we should have a robust discussion on the 21st. Any additional comments, Mr. Alden or Mr. McGlynn?
None from me.
No, sir.
Okay, then thank you for that presentation. We'll then go to item 4.2, an update on credit rating. Mr. Alden, are you introducing this item?
I am. Mayor Schwedhelm, this is just a brief update. We received a call. I received a call from Moody's. This is a standard procedure that happens from the different credit agencies out there. They actually monitor budgets, local government budgets, and when they see things that sort of raise the red flag, they will call us and get our sense of what we're doing, or they'll explain their concerns, and we get an opportunity to address those. So I think it was about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, I did receive a call from Moody's. They saw our presentation. They saw that our reserves were forecasted to be around $1 million. And given the drop that it had from prior, or the year prior, they wanted to know about that. So we had about a 45-minute discussion. I don't recommend that if you ever do not need to go through it. But all in all, it was a good call. We talked about our initial strategies for shoring up our reserves by implementing a hiring freeze, by scrubbing certain projects to return back to the general fund, to provide us that type of flexibility, to let us move forward, to see how the fiscal year end will wind up, to get a better assessment on the recession, and then to potentially either stand pat or make different budget choices come September. So all in all, they were happy with that strategy. They are going to, for all local governments, they are going to give a negative outlook for all local governments, just based on the impacts of the loss of revenue due to the shelter in place in all communities. And but they did say that for Santa Rosa, we have a strong rating already. We're at AA2, which is very strong. they like the fact that we had some flexibility to be able to shore up our reserves, so they do not anticipate to give a negative note to ours. So we, anything can happen. I haven't seen it in writing yet, but it was a very positive call from that standpoint. We'll get a call as they go through their credit analysis and their meeting to talk about that. We'll get a call back on whether it's going to go either way, but she did not anticipate any changes to our bond rating through this. And as an FYI, we went through the same thing after the Tubbs fire. So it is a normal occurrence. They call it local budget surveillance or something like that they do. Very ominous that they use the word surveillance with that, but it's a normal part of the thing. But I wanted you to kind of know that bond rating is very, the city's credit rating is very important. It helps us to be able to have decently priced bond issuances in the future. And at least from their position, we're taking the right steps necessary to be able to navigate through this process.
Okay, thank you for that. One question I have, since we have another budget meeting September 15th,
yeah.
At the end of that meeting, would it be beneficial for us to loop out to Moody's, or would Moody's check in with, okay, we continue to agree with the direction the city of Santa Rosa is going?
They would probably contact us. If all things stay the same as I think that it will in our credit rating saying the same, I wouldn't loop out to them unless I had to.
It's another opportunity, Alan. Okay.
Yeah, I know. An opportunity to succeed.
Yes, thank you, Alan. I'm curious to know if at the time that you spoke with them, I know that it was, you said a few weeks ago?
Yes.
So we were thinking we're going to get the PG&E money, but it's not like it is now where the mayor's got a check in his pocket, right?
No, we did talk about the PG&E money and how that would also be a part of it, noting that it's one-time money. So it's not something that would be looked at as an ongoing source of revenue, but it could be used, and I emphasize the word could, it could be used to do things like shore up reserves or do any of those types of things in the community. They were happy with the idea that we were taking that look toward it.
Well, I find it interesting, and this is more just a commentary on their process, that, COVID is also, a one-time event. So, that we could be penalized for one, but not credited for the other. Obviously, there's no saying how the payment will be spent. So I do understand that, but I can hear that it was an unpleasant call, but I do hope that if we, as a council, take action to make sure that our reserves are where they need to be, that we would reach out to them and let them know so that we can get credit where credit is deserved. And I hate to add more to your plate, but I do think that our bond rating is really important, especially if we are setting aside money, for that.
That wouldn't be a problem to reach out to them. I'd be happy to do it. It was just we're in a good position now, but absolutely.
We'll get you a drink for afterward, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yes, I did hear I'd be happy to reach out. So happy, Alan. Mr. Sawyer, do you have any additional questions or feedback? Okay, we're now taking public comment on item 4.2, update on credit rating. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Madam Zoom host or recording secretary, would you take it from here?
You bet. Just sharing my screen. Mayor, I am seeing no hands being raised for this item, and we did not receive any email public comments on 4.2.
All right, thank you. Item 5 on our agenda is next meeting agenda items. For either staff or Mr. Sawyer, Ms. Fleming, any items needed to be added to our next agenda?
I think it's always there. It's always hanging out there. Is the status of our reserves, and I'm sure there will be plenty of conversation during our goal setting, et cetera. So I'm sure that if something comes up that that Alan will be more than happy to add it to our agenda, and maybe we might even be discussing some of the results of conversations around the sales tax measures, updates, whatever.
Okay. Ms. Fleming, do you have something to add? Oop, your hand's not up anymore.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that, sort of what I was hinting at before around PG&E, that if there are developments around how that might impact our long-term finance, or if something comes out of goal setting for long-term finance, I suppose there's nothing concrete to put on the agenda at this point, but it seems that we might need a placeholder, or just even a mental placeholder, that things are changing rapidly, and we'll need to be on our toes on this committee.
Yep, I would agree. And I don't have any specifics. I think our August 4th goal setting will give us some clues as to when we need to meet next. So with that, Mr. Alder and Mr. McGlynn, is there anything else you would like this subcommittee to discuss today?
No, sir.
No.
Okay, with that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.